So thanks for joining us today for our Grinds on a Dime, an online cooking series with affordable, easy recipes to feed your family. I'm Hallie Cristobal, and my colleague cooking today is Marielle Hampton, and we are both extension agents with the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, or CTAHR. As part of Cooperative Extension Service, we provide science-based public outreach and education to support families, youth, older adults, and residents across the lifespan in Hawaii. All right, and last but definitely not least, don't forget to wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds before you're working with food or eating. And make sure that you are, if you are gonna go use the bathroom or do anything like that and you are cooking with us again today, please make sure you wash your hands, wash all your fruits and vegetables, so we can keep our food safety in check. Okay, today's recipes, we have seafood, we have a seafood stew, and we have a mackerel patties, and we have tuna couscous salad. So Marielle is going to be taking it away. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will spotlight hers.
All right, everybody, let's get going. We have some great recipes today. We figured that since Thanksgiving is coming up, you're all about to eat a lot of turkey, probably some really heavy foods. So we thought some seafood recipes might be a nice way to mix things up before the big day, have some different flavors in the mix. So we're going to start by cooking some mackerel patties. Then we'll do a seafood stew, and while that's cooking, we'll finish with the tuna couscous salad while that seafood stew finishes cooking. All right, so these mackerel patties. I love this recipe because not only is it super affordable and really easy to keep the ingredients on hand, it's really simple and it can be customized. So we start with a can of mackerel, which is really cheap out of all of the fishes out there. Mackerel for I think a 15-ounce can or something like that is maybe $3. So you're going to start by opening up your can of mackerel, draining the brine, and then pouring it out into a bowl. It's going to look something like this. You'll notice that there's still skin on the fish as well as bones. And you could take those out, but I would really encourage you to leave them in because they're actually really soft at this point and they'll just sort of melt into the patties as you mash them up. And as we know, eating bones is going to be really great for calcium intake. So I would recommend keeping those in there and just going ahead and mashing this up really well so that those bones get all crushed and mixed up with everything else. I've never tried making this with sardines, but I imagine it would be similar. You might need more sardines because a can of mackerel is pretty large, and sardines typically come in smaller cans. So after you mash up your mackerel really well, we're just going to add 2 other ingredients. That's what I love about this. You know, you could always mix things up and add some of your own spices and things, but the basics are fine. You start with a can of mackerel, you add 2 eggs, and then you'll add half a cup of seasoned breadcrumbs. So if you have panko around instead of breadcrumbs, you could do that and then just add your own spices and seasonings to make this mix. You know, the same as if you were doing something like meatballs or meatloaf, any kind of patties, you know, you have your breadcrumbs, your protein, and then usually some egg. So we're just going to mix this up until it's all uniform. And then we're going to form it into patties and fry it up. Now, because we have eggs in this, you want to make sure that you're cooking it really well when you're frying it up. So when I make my patties, you'll notice that I try to keep them pretty flat and thin. So we make sure they get cooked all the way through to make sure that those eggs get cooked all the way through.
And Maria, we have a question. We have, what kind of seasoned breadcrumbs did you use?
I just use those Italian breadcrumbs. Forget what the company is, but you know, they come in the big cylinder, and that sort of thing. I just usually keep those on hand.
And also, if you don't have breadcrumbs, you could always make your own breadcrumbs by toasting some bread and like pulverizing them in a food processor or a blender. And if you are the type of person that has panko on hand, you could also use that as well. But the worst or the least used option would be you could also add in some flour instead.
Great, thanks for that. So I'm going to put on gloves because I just don't like working with raw ingredients, especially if, since I'm doing the demo, it's not easy for me to step away and do some hand washing. So I'm going to form these into about 4 patties. I'm going to turn on my stove and I'm going to use about 2 tablespoons of oil. Now, this is important. If you're like me, I like to cook everything in olive oil, but what I've learned is if you're frying, you really need to be using a high heat oil. So here I'm using canola oil. You could also use, I think, peanut oil would work, or avocado oil, things which are meant to be used for frying. Olive oil will smoke at a low level of heat, and we really don't want that when we're frying. So I'm heating up the oil right now. Now, if you're like me, I'm a little bit scared of frying. It takes a little bit of getting used to. So I'm making sure that my oil is hot enough because it's shimmering right now. And I might also drop a little piece of my mix in there to see if it's going to start sizzling. Looks like it could use another second here. So I'm just going to go get the rest of my patties ready. So those are getting fried up nicely. So the key to frying really is patience. You're going to want to be messing with them and, you know, moving them around and stuff like that. But you really want to avoid that because if you try to move something that's being fried too soon, it's going to stick to the bottom. Do you really want to wait until you have a nice round bottom to whatever you're cooking before you try to flip it? And an easy way to see if it's ready is to give the pan a little shake. And if it's sticking, like a couple of these you can see are sticking to the bottom, that means they still aren't quite ready to flip. All right, and while we're cooking those, I'm gonna go ahead and get some wasabi mayo started. So this is a great topping. You can use a lot of different toppings for these, but this one I think is a nice complement. I've also used barbecue sauce. That's really tasty as well. You could also do like a chipotle lime sour cream. But to make wasabi mayo, super easy. This is a ½ cup of mayonnaise, and I'm just going to add about 2 teaspoons of wasabi paste. If you have the powder, that would probably work as well, although I've never tried that. And then you just mix that up. And you can add, you'll just have to taste it and add more or less, depending on how much spice you like. All right, let's take a look at these patties. I'm ready to flip. Ooh, see that nice browning? That's what you want to see. I think we were talking earlier about other things you can use instead of mackerel. You could also certainly use canned salmon. I think that would be a great alternative. You can also add some other things into that. I've made these with a little bit of mashed sweet potato in them as well, and that was really tasty.
I've made tuna patties, and instead of using breadcrumbs, I've used ulu as like my binder with the egg. And that, I don't know, I don't eat seafood, but I was told they're very good.
All right, while we give those another second, I'm gonna go ahead and get my plate ready. So I just like to use hamburger buns. I would really recommend putting lettuce on these. The crunch and the freshness of the lettuce is a really nice complement to the richness of the fish. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take my wasabi mayo, spread a little bit of that on the bun. Add some lettuce leaves. And then it's gonna be ready for our patties. So you can see that as pretty common, we aren't getting a perfectly even cooking going on here, but that's okay. I can just, when I flip it over, move them around a little bit so that I get the coloring to be more even. All right. Let's see how this one's looking. All right, I would say this one's pretty good. Again, you want to make sure that it's cooked very thoroughly because the center needs to reach a temperature that's going to cook the egg that we had in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take one of my patties and go ahead and add it to my sandwich. Now, something you could add to customize this is some chives you could add to the mix. I'm just going to throw a few on there. And there you go, super simple, 3 ingredients. And like I said, if you don't like wasabi mayo, these are really good with barbecue sauce as well. Really tasty. There you go. Super simple. I love this recipe because I don't eat a ton of tuna or things like that because they are generally pretty high in mercury, depending on the type that you get. Mackerel, on the other hand, is very low in mercury. Mackerel are very low on the food chain, and so they tend to have lower levels of mercury, but they have some of the highest levels of omega-3s, which are those healthy fats that we want, that's kind of brain food. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and take these off the heat. And we'll have these for dinner. They're really tasty. They reheat well if you want to eat them as leftovers. And we were talking about before the class, you could also kind of mix these up, and rather than doing them burger style, you could eat them on rice with maybe a little shoyu and wasabi mayo and even nori if you wanted. So a lot of different ways to eat these. Any questions while we get ready for our next recipe?
And if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat and I will read it out.
Okay, our next recipe is seafood stew. So I'm gonna get those ingredients ready. Okay, so for this one, I'm gonna be using a big soup pot. And we're gonna start with some oil. This one you could start with olive oil because we're not frying, we're just going to be sauteing some garlic and onions. So we'll add a couple tablespoons of oil and get that heated up. We're going to add 1 diced onion and about 4 or 5 minced garlic cloves. Of course, if you're like me, I always double the garlic because I love garlic, but that's just me. So this seafood stew, it's actually an Italian American recipe. It originated in the San Francisco area. It was sort of a stew that was made with kind of whatever seafood was available that day when the fishing ships came in. So you can see recipes that use things like crab or shrimp or mussels, whatever you have on hand, or fish. This one, we're just going to be using a frozen seafood medley because that's affordable and really easy. So I'm just adding my diced onion, my minced garlic. We're just going to cook those for a couple of minutes until the onions get translucent. So once these get cooked, we're going to add in a can of chicken broth. And as per usual, if you don't have chicken broth, you can use better than bouillon and water, or you could also use just a bouillon cube, but that does have higher sodium, I think, than the better than bouillon. We'll also be adding a 28-ounce can of crushed tomatoes, and that's going to make the base of this tomatoey seafood stew. So I think traditionally this dish, cioppino, is made with wine, but I don't always have wine on hand and it's not always the cheapest thing. So this recipe doesn't use wine, but if you have some, you're welcome to throw it in. White wine would be great. I think you could also probably use a little bit of red wine. I would just sub it for a little bit of the chicken broth, probably. All right, these are cooking real quick. We're about ready to add our liquid. So along with that chicken broth and the tomatoes, we're going to be adding a jar of sliced roasted bell peppers. So I have just drained these and I'm just going to be adding the whole thing directly into the soup. It's a nice little shortcut. It adds some nice flavor with that roasted taste without having to roast those bell peppers yourself. You could also feel free to add in some other vegetables that you have on hand. I think it's pretty versatile. Like I said, this is a soup that's traditionally made with whatever is around. So it can usually handle some different things thrown into the mix. Okay. I think we're about ready for our liquid. So 1 can of chicken broth is about, it looks like a cup and a half of liquid. And then our crushed tomatoes. These are kind of a shortcut. If you had fresh tomatoes on hand, you could absolutely use those or diced tomatoes. I just like the texture of the crushed tomatoes a little bit better. It doesn't have to cook down as much the way you would with fresh tomatoes to kind of deepen the flavor. If you had tomato sauce, you could use that as well. All right. We'll add a couple more ingredients and then we'll just be bringing this to a simmer. So I'm going to add my roasted bell pepper. Don't those look good? I love roasted bell pepper. I just like smoky flavors. And for seasonings or for herbs and spices, what we have here is 2 teaspoons of dried oregano and 1 teaspoon of crushed red pepper. Now, if you don't like spicy foods, I might advise you to actually tone down the red pepper, the crushed red pepper, because this will make it surprisingly spicy from just 1 teaspoon. And we're gonna simmer this all together, which will give us some time for our flavors to kind of meld. I'm gonna add some salt and pepper. And as you can imagine, this goes really well with some herbs, like fresh herbs. Basil is one that would go really well with this. All right, so we're just going to be bringing this to a boil, and then we will turn it down slightly and let it simmer for about 20 minutes. If you don't have 20 minutes, I think that you would be fine to just skip the simmering step and go straight to adding your seafood, but that's up to you. I think it does help to have that little bit of extra time for the flavors to come together if you have a little time to just let it sit and cook for that second. So we're gonna let these simmer while we move on to our next recipe. So any questions about that while we let this come to a simmer? And again, the last step is we're going to be adding in that bag of frozen seafood medley and letting that cook until that's ready. Okay, so our next recipe is going to be a tuna couscous salad. Now this one is a great recipe for a lunch. It's kind of a lighter dish, so if you did want to have it as a dinner, you may want to either double it or maybe have a few sides with it. But what I like about this recipe is you don't have to heat up your whole house to cook it. And when you have hot nights like we do in the summertime, it's really nice to not have to use the stove or the oven when you're making dinner. So our ingredients for this are going to be a can of drained and rinsed dark red kidney beans. You could use light red. 2 cans of tuna. I have used chunk light tuna here, but you could also use albacore or other types of tuna, as well as other types of canned fish if you wanted. A chopped bunch of parsley. I've used parsley from my garden, so I made sure to wash that really well. And a pint of chopped tomatoes. We're going to be mixing those together with a 1/4 cup of drained capers. If you're like me and you're not crazy about capers, you could always do a little bit less. And then a 1/2 cup of sliced pepperoncinis. Those are sort of like banana peppers. They're really salty and acidic. These, I think, are my favorite part of this salad. And once you have a jar of them, you can just keep it in the fridge and they'll last for a long time. And then, of course, for a bit of dressing, we have just the juice of 1 lemon. And then I also have, for serving, just some sliced lemons, because it's nice to be able to put a little bit of lemon over the finished salad and serve it with that so it looks nice and pretty.
Maria, we have a question if you can leave the capers out.
Yes, I think you could. You might want something else with salt. So one variation you could try is Kalamata olive, I think would be great in this. There are also, you could do, let's see, probably you could do canned black olives as well. Those would have a little bit of salt. But yeah, I think it would be fine to leave those out. That's personal preference. This is another one of those dishes that can get really personalized according to what you have in your fridge that day. You could throw in some leftover veggies. You could throw in, you know, some larger tomatoes if you don't have the little cherry tomatoes, that sort of thing, as well as other proteins. I think this salad would be great with some hard-boiled eggs in it. You could also throw in some drained, rinsed chickpeas from a can if you didn't want to do the beans. So very versatile. And once you taste it, you can get a sense. The flavors are pretty simple, so it's easy to mix and match. Now, the real star of this salad for me is the couscous. So those of you who haven't had couscous, you're in for a treat. So couscous comes either in bulk, or I just buy a box like this. This is a 10-ounce box, and this is what it looks like in the bowl. So couscous is great to keep on hand because it's basically like really tiny pasta, so it cooks very quickly. I like to use couscous if, for example, I'm about to finish cooking a dish and I realize I forgot to make rice. You can just boil some water and have couscous ready to go in literally 5 minutes. So it's really great for that. And like I said, you actually don't need to use a stove to cook couscous. And once I figured that out, that was a game changer. So basically, I poured 1 box of couscous in here. And I also put about a tablespoon of butter. You can also use olive oil. And then all I'm going to do is boil some water in my electric kettle, which if you don't have an electric kettle, I really recommend it. It's one of my favorite tools in the kitchen. It makes things so much easier and faster. Even when I'm cooking pasta, a lot of the time I will just fill up my electric kettle and use that to get the water started, because it actually saves me some time in boiling water for the pasta. So when you're cooking couscous, so I just put that water on to boil. What you need is a bowl. Like I said, some butter or olive oil, and salt is also good. Throw in a little bit of salt. And then you just need a tight fitting lid. So basically, I'm going to put in my boiling water, close the lid really tightly, and then I am going to just let it steam for 5 minutes. And then you'll fluff it with a fork, and that's pretty much all you need to do. Looks like I actually just blew a fuse, so hang on a second.
And just a FYI, if you guys are using induction burners, that is really common for you to blow a fuse. So usually what I like to do is, if you are using induction burner, please make sure you're using that only in that one outlet. Or you can use an extension cord and put it to a different outlet on a different side of the wall or something like that. It would help you so you wouldn't. But that happens to me a lot, especially in cooking workshops. So I feel you.
Yeah, that's using an induction burner is new to me too. And yeah, so that's something to keep in mind. It draws a lot of power. All right. So while I'm boiling that water for the couscous salad, we're going to go back over here and see. I just tripped the power again. But we've got some nice simmering action going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and get my seafood medley out of the freezer. Important note, when you're using things like frozen seafood or even frozen produce, you don't want to generally take it out of the freezer before you're ready to use it if it's something that's pre-cooked, because you could technically be growing like unhealthy bacteria while it's thawing. So you just want to be careful about something like that. I wouldn't want to take out my bag of frozen seafood and then leave it on the counter until I was ready to use it. You got to be careful with your food safety. All right, so just 1 second while I go grab that. Okay, so this is what I got. It's a 14-ounce bag of seafood mix. So I think this cost maybe $8. It's not a ton of seafood, but in terms of affordability, I think this is a great option and it's really easy to keep on hand. You can use it for stir fries or chowders, soups, things like that. We've got some shrimp as well as some mussels and squid and a couple other things in here. So basically, we have our simmering seafood stew, our cioppino. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And we're going to add in the seafood mix pretty much right before we eat. You do not want to overcook seafood as it will get rubbery. So I'm pretty much going to be adding this in. These are fully cooked already, and I'll probably cook it for about 5 minutes. And then taste the seafood. You want the seafood to be tender, not rubbery. So we've got that. It's going to take a second for the soup to get back up to the heat we want it to be, because we added this frozen stuff. So we'll just give that a minute to get back up to a simmer, and then we'll let that simmer for 5 minutes and give it a taste. But it's already looking pretty good, right? All right, I'm going to go ahead and grab my boiling water to add to our couscous. Okay, so for an entire box of couscous, it calls for 2 cups of water or chicken broth you can use instead. Okay, now I'm just going to give that a quick stir so that it incorporates that butter, and then put that lid on. So it is 6:05. So at 6:10, we'll come back and check out our couscous. Let's set that aside. In the meantime, we're just going to mix together the ingredients to go on top of our couscous. So I'm just going to use, actually, this. Let's mix everything together. So our pint of halved cherry or grape tomatoes. If you can find them local, there are some great local cherry and grape tomatoes, like Ho Farms on Oahu is a good one. And it's great to support local, and it actually isn't that much more expensive than getting ones from the mainland. And I think that the flavor is just so much better. All right, our can of kidney beans. I have to say, kidney beans are one of my absolute favorite proteins. I don't know what it is, but the flavor is just so great to me. The texture, they're so soft when you get them in the can. Okay, capers, which again, you can leave out if you'd like. A half a cup of sliced and drained pepperoncini. You see how these colors are all really kind of nice and complementary. We've got our red, our bright red from the tomatoes, the deep sort of purple of the kidney beans, this bright, vibrant green of the pepperoncinis. And then you also can add your parsley. So this is a ton of parsley. If you aren't as crazy about parsley, you could totally just mix in a little bit of parsley, or even switch it out for another kind of fresh herb. You could probably use chives or basil or oregano, things like that. We just want some of that fresh herby flavor in there. You could always add more later. And then I'm adding in my 2 cans of drained tuna. So I am using chunk light tuna. Now, that's kind of the cheaper version of tuna. You can see it's sort of, it's not as firm. It's already sort of flaky and broken up like that. But I actually like to use chunk light tuna because the mercury levels are lower. It's actually, you know, the mercury levels in albacore tuna are higher, almost 3 times higher on average. And that's what you typically find in a regular can of tuna. The chunk light tuna is actually typically a different species. I think they typically use skipjack tuna, which is lower on the food chain and so has lower levels of mercury. Of course, mercury is going to be most concerning for pregnant women and small children. So those are the folks who have to be the most careful. But even as an adult, I think that if you weigh 140 pounds, you're supposed to eat albacore tuna only every 10 days is the recommendation from, I think, the FDA and the EPA to make sure you're careful about those mercury levels. Whereas for something like this chunk light tuna, I think every 3 or 4 days is fine. So we've got all of our salad ingredients mixed up there. Then we're just going to add the juice of 1 lemon. Mix that up. So really, that's the only dressing that this mixture has. If you want, you could mix this all together with the couscous itself, but I think that the presentation is nicer and kind of gives you more control if you just put this on top of your couscous. All right, so let's see. I think we're ready to check on our couscous. Let's take a look. It's been 5 minutes. All right, got the little sunken part there. So we'll just grab a fork and fluff it up. This is the most satisfying part.
I love couscous. I never really ate it when I was younger. And then actually when I was in college, my roommate used to eat couscous all the time. And I was like, oh, that looks funny. But she made me try a salad that she made and I've been in love ever since. But I love like a garlic infused couscous. It's my guilty pleasure.
Yeah, that sounds so good. I mean, if I'm almost jealous if you've never had couscous before, because once you try it, it's going to be like, oh, what a revelation. It's really fun to integrate. And like, you can eat it cold. You can eat it hot. You can, you know, do so much with it, make salads with it. So I just am such a huge fan of couscous. So I served myself a really healthy portion. I'm just going to scoop some of my tuna mixture right on top of there. Look at those gorgeous colors. I might even add in some more of those pepperoncini because I just love them so much. I don't know if you guys have ever had those before, but they're great. All right, and a couple more of these tomatoes on top of the color. And we'll serve it with a little wedge of lemon so that you can squeeze that lemon over the whole dish if you'd like. So this is, you know, pretty healthy as far as it gets. You saw everything that went into it. The most expensive ingredients are probably going to be the pepperoncini, actually, might be the most expensive part. The rest of it is super affordable. And especially if you can get things like the beans on sale, capers, things like that. Those you can just keep in your fridge or your pantry for whenever you want to use them. The only fresh ingredients here are really the parsley and those tomatoes. Any questions? I have to say, I'm going to be eating this as soon as this is over. I've been craving this couscous salad ever since I was getting ready. All right, we're just going to turn our attention back here to our seafood soup, our cioppino. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. I need my ladle. So take a look at that. In that scoopful, we've got some great, looks like octopus, squid, some shrimp, some mussels. It's a nice hearty soup. I would just give it a taste before you serve it out to make sure that the seafood is cooked to your liking. You know, you don't just want it to be cooked through, you really want it to be tender, but again, not overcooked and rubbery. So this is something that I would recommend serving with fresh herbs if you have them. I think it would go really well with basil. So that's what I'm going to be using. I've got some basil from my garden. Tear up a few pieces of that. They go really well in there. And of course, a nice little garnish on top. This would probably also be good with some Parmesan cheese. I've never tried that, but I think that would be nice.
I feel like that'd be really good with just like some really hearty, crusty bread.
Yes, exactly. And I bought some just for the occasion. You can serve this with rice, but I think that bread, of course, being from San Francisco, I think this is a really good dish to go with some bread if you do have it. We'll stick that right in there. Looks good. All right, so those are our dishes for today. We've got 3 affordable, fast recipes. Look, it only took us 45 minutes, not counting the prep time for chopping up some of these veggies. But we have our tuna couscous salad, lots of fresh herbs and delicious veggies. We've got our seafood medley soup or cioppino, and it doesn't look so pretty anymore because I cut it open, but our mackerel patties. All right, so I would definitely encourage you guys to make one of these dishes in the next week, because we know you're about to get tons of delicious, fatty foods that you can indulge in over the holiday season. So it's nice to pick something that's a little bit of a mix or uses a different protein. So we make sure that we're always getting enough seafood in our diets, if you can. I know Haley doesn't eat seafood, but for those of us who do, really great healthy options that you can try to integrate into your rotation that you make on a regular basis.